Welcome back, class. Today we'll finish our conversation on cognition and a couple of more items. This session will look at historical views, neuroscience, the concepts of modularity, and embodied cognition. So, the mind and brain. The cognitive neuroscience approach. Cognitive neuroscience aims to provide a brain-based account of our cognitive processes, such as thinking, perceiving, remembering. It's made possible by technological advances in studying the brain that are safer and less crude than, say, Penfield's method of brain surgery. Historical foundations. Do mental experiences arise in the heart or the brain? That was a question for many centuries. How can a physical substance such as the brain or body give rise to mental experiences? This revisits our mind-body problem that we began discussing in Chapter 4. Rene Descartes introduced this idea with his notion of dualism, that the mind and body are separate substances. We also looked at the dual aspect theory, where the mind and body are two levels of explanation of the same thing. We also looked at reductionism. The mind eventually will be explained solely in terms of the physical or biological theory. These issues still are relevant to modern cognitive neuroscience. In the early views, anatomists believed that ventricles, those spaces in the brain, were very important. Cortex was often schematically drawn on top or misrepresented like intestines on the bottom left until about the 18th century. Later, we see a more accurate depiction of the brain on the far bottom right. We also are familiar and recall phrenology. Phrenology by Franz Gall. The idea where different parts of the cortex serve different functions. Differences in personality traits manifest in differences in cortical size and bumps on the skull. And one could be trained to read these bumps in order to tell something about one's personality. This crude division of psychological traits are not grounded in science. In fact, phrenology was seen more as a pseudoscience. So, although phrenology is discredited, the notion that different regions of the brain serve different functions has stood the test of time. This idea is termed functional specialization. Modern cognitive neuroscience uses empirical methods to ascertain different functions. It does not assume that each region has one function or each function has a discrete location, unlike phrenology, but does assume some degree of specialization of neurons in particular regions of the brain. Functional specialization. We see how this was understood by looking at the work of Broca. There was a patient with left frontal lesion called TAN who could not speak but had otherwise good cognitive abilities. This suggested a specialized language faculty in the brain. Later we see with Wernicke. Later observed a patient with poor speech comprehension but good production. This suggests at least two language faculties in the brain, one for comprehension and the other for production, that can be independently affected by brain damage. In the early days of exploration of how the brain functions and how they are related to certain types of behaviors, it was not unusual for someone to display during their lifetime an odd, unusual behavior or deficit of some sort. The local smart person would then wait till that person would die and then observe and compare their brain to people who did not suffer such deficits. It was in this way, quite often, that it was discovered as to what areas of the brain might be responsible for certain types of functions. Note that the faculties were inferred from empirical observation. This inference can be made without necessarily knowing where in the brain they are located. This approach later became known as cognitive neuropsychology. So, cognitive neuroscience. Let's look a little bit at how it sort of evolved. In the 1970s, structural imaging methods, CT, MRI, enabled the precise images of the brain and brain lesions. In the 1980s, PET adapted to models of cognition developed by psychologists. And then in 1985, you have transcranial magnetic stimulation, first used as a non-invasive, safer equivalent to Penfield's earlier studies where they would actually open up the brain and start looking into it directly. In 1990, the level of oxygen in blood used as a measure of cognitive function. This is the principle behind functional MRIs. Now let's introduce this idea once we have a little bit of a foundation and what cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience is and how it sort of progresses. What are some of the concepts behind these notions? We first look at modularity. Jerry Fodor, 1983. Fodor argues that certain psychological processes are self-contained or modular. This is in contrast to the new look of modern cognitivist positions which hold that nearly all psychological processes are interconnected and freely exchange information. So modularity is suggesting that no, at some levels they don't exchange information. They are encapsulated, they're blocked off. Unlike the common held belief that they're all connected and exchange information freely. Fodor proposed a three-tiered cognitive system. The first level of the system is the transducer level, where we transform environmental signals into a form that can be used by the organism. And we know this as transduction. You remember this from previous classes, I'm sure. We have environmental stimuli, and we have specialized sensory receptors throughout our body that can pick up on that specific type of environmental stimuli. But light waves and sound waves, well, we can't do anything with them within our body. So they have to be turned into a type of energy that we can use. So a sound wave must be transduced into a neural impulse, transduction. The second level, the input systems level, performs basic recognition and description functions, and Fodor's model input systems are modular. The third level of the system, higher level cognitive functions, performs complex operations on the output of the input systems. An example of higher level processes is like thinking in analogies. So what we see with this three-tiered system is a new look at how it is that we think, our cognition. The first level being very basic of trying to say we turn one form of energy, that environmental stimuli, into another that we can use. The other is where we have modularity, and then the next one we don't have modularity, where we perform more complex cognitive operations. So looking at modularity a little bit more deeply here, Fodor holds that the input systems are modular and that higher level cognitive processes are non-modular. This means that all of the information necessary for performing their tasks of recognition and description is contained within the input system. For example, object perception might be modular, in which case the object perception module need not reference language modules or music modules or mathematics modules in order to perform its operations. It's all self-contained. In contrast, higher level processes have access to all information contained within the cognitive system when performing a given operation. So Fodor provides an example of scientific reasoning. Potentially, when solving a scientific problem, a scientist can reference any knowledge that he or she has about the world to help solve this problem. As such, if necessary, knowledge about botany can be referenced in order to understand problems in mathematics. So modularity prevents us from going outside the module. Higher level cognitive processes, however, allow us to reference other material. So modular systems have the following properties. 1. They are domain specific. They operate on and have computational architecture that is unique to certain stimuli. 2. Their operation is mandatory, or they are cognitively impenetrable. beliefs cannot affect the operations of modules. We cannot help seeing or hearing the world in a certain way. We're locked in that module. Modules are fast. Modular processes are among the fastest psychological processes. This is because modules are self-contained and need not spend time referencing information outside of the module to complete their tasks. 4. Modules are informationally encapsulated. They need not reference any other psychological systems in order to perform their operations. And 5. Modules have shallow outputs. The output of modules is very basic. More complex representations follow at higher level computation. So, let's look at modular informational encapsulation. Even when we know it is an illusion, we are still susceptible to the illusion. The illusion we see at the left here is an illusion. What our eyes are telling us we know is incorrect information, but yet we still have no ability but others to see what we see. The other concept is embodied cognition. Cognition is embodied when it is deeply dependent upon features of the physical body of an agent. That is, when aspects of the agent's body beyond the brain play a significant causal or physical constitutive role in cognitive processing. In general, dominant views in the philosophy of mind and cognitive science have considered the body as peripheral to understanding the nature of mind and cognition. Go back to what we started talking about in chapter 4 with philosophy of mind with Descartes. The mind and the body are separate entities. Sometimes the nature of the dependence of cognition on the body is quite unexpected and suggests new ways of conceptualizing and exploring the mechanics of cognitive processing. So embodied cognition is sort of flying in the face of what René Descartes proposed a long time ago. Maybe there isn't such a great difference or separation between this mind that we propose exists and the body that we possess. Embodied cognition. Embodied cognitive science encompasses a loose-knit family of research programs in the cognitive sciences that often share a commitment to critiquing and even replacing the traditional approaches to cognition and cognitive processing. Relatively recent work on the embodiment of cognition provides much food for thought for empirically informed philosophers of mind. This is in part because of the rich range of phenomena that embodied cognitive science has studied, but it is also in part because those phenomena are often thought to challenge dominant views of the mind, such as the computational and representational theories of mind at the heart of traditional cognitive neuroscience. And they have sometimes been taken to undermine standard positions in the philosophy of mind, such as the idea that the mind is identical to or even realized in the brain. And think about it. That's what we do believe. When we think about the mind, we inevitably think about the physical representation of that mind being the brain. So embodied cognition sort of raises some of those beliefs or views into question. So, embodied cognition, some examples. Consider 4 evocative examples of phenomena that have motivated embodied cognitive science. 1. We typically gesture when we speak to one another, and gesturing facilitates not just communication but language processing itself. And recall, we've mentioned several times already that this idea of language and thinking or intelligence have been intertwined for some time. 2. Vision is often action guiding, and bodily movement and the feedback it generates are more tightly integrated into at least some visual processing that has been anticipated by traditional models of vision. So as we are visualizing something and behaving in certain ways, that information is necessary for us to process, cognitively process information about what we're doing, how we're doing, what is our motivation, what we're trying to accomplish. 3, there are neurons, like mirror neurons, that fire not only when we undertake an action, but do so when we observe others undertaking the same actions. 4, we are often able to perform cognitive tasks, such as remembering more effectively, by using our bodies and even parts of our surrounding environments to offload storage and simplify the nature of cognitive processing. Remember the term too, muscle memory. Okay? Maybe that too sort of highlights some of these ideas of embodied cognition. So, where are we now? Although phenomena such as we've seen in 1 through 4 items in the previous slide motivate embodied cognitive science, appealing to such phenomena to arrive at more substantive conclusions that have been drawn, for example, the traditional cognitive science is deeply flawed, or that dominant positions in the philosophy of mind, such as functionalism, are mistaken, requires further philosophical argument. Because the required argumentation typically appeals to other concepts, such as the work in empirically informed philosophy of mind and cognitive science itself, such as modularity and nativism. Debate over embodied cognition has become a hot topic in cognitive science in the recent years.